There are moments in life that split everything in two, before and after, and most of the time you don't recognize them while they're happening. You only look back weeks or months later and realize that was it. That was the exact second everything changed direction. For me, it was a Thursday night in late November, 11:47 p.m., rain hammering the windows of my apartment in Asheville, North Carolina, and a knock on my door so quiet I almost mistook it for the wind. My name is Caleb Morrow. I'm 31 years old. I work as a Finnish carpenter, mostly custom shelving, kitchen renovations, the kind of work that leaves sawdust in your hair and calluses on your palms. I live alone in a second-floor apartment above a bookshop on Lexington Avenue. It's small, one bedroom, one bathroom, a kitchen that barely fits two people standing side by side, and a living room window that looks out over the Blue Ridge Mountains on clear mornings. I chose this place because the light comes in soft and golden around 7 a.m., and because the old woman who owns the bookshop downstairs, Mrs. Hayworth, never complains about the noise when I'm sanding wood at midnight. But I should tell you about the knock, because that's where the real story starts. And once it started, I couldn't stop it any more than you can stop a river from running downhill. I wasn't expecting anyone. I had just gotten out of the shower, hair still damp, wearing a gray t-shirt and sweatpants, eating cold leftover pasta, standing at the kitchen counter because I hadn't had time for dinner. The job site had run late. A client in Biltmore Village wanted her built-in bookshelves finished before Thanksgiving, and I'd promised her I'd make it happen. My phone was on the table, face down. I hadn't checked it in hours. So when I heard the knock, I froze with a fork halfway to my mouth and stared at the door like it had spoken to me. I set the fork down, wiped my hands on my shirt, and crossed the room. When I opened the door, I saw a woman standing in the hallway with a rolling suitcase at her side, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and mascara running in thin lines down her cheeks. Her dark hair was wet from the rain and plastered against the sides of her face. She was shaking, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, the kind of trembling that starts in a place no jacket can reach. She looked at me and said 5 words that I can still hear every time I close my eyes. I have nowhere else to go, and I knew her. Of course I knew her. She was Nora Callahan, my best friend's younger sister. But let me take you back, because if you don't understand who Jake Callahan was to me, you won't understand why what happened next nearly destroyed me from the inside out. I met Jake my freshman year at UNC. He was loud, reckless, the kind of guy who would start a conversation with a stranger at a gas station and somehow end up invited to their family barbecue that weekend. I was the opposite, quiet, careful, more comfortable measuring angles than making small talk. We became friends the way fire becomes friends with dry wood. He pulled me out of my silence and I kept him from burning everything down. By the time we graduated, Jake was closer to me than my own brother. We worked construction together for 2 years. We built a deck on his mother's house with our own hands. When my father died of pancreatic cancer the year I turned 26, Jake drove 4 hours in the middle of the night to sit with me in a hospital waiting room and didn't say a word for 3 hours because he knew I didn't need words. I needed someone to just be there, and he was. But there was one thing Jake made me promise, and he made me promise it more than once. He said it the first time when we were 22, sitting on his mother's porch drinking cheap beer while the cicadas screamed in the trees. He turned to me with that half-serious, half-joking look he always wore when he meant something deeply, but didn't want to seem like he did. "Caleb," he said, "swear to me you'll never go after my sister." I laughed because I thought he was kidding. Nora was 18 at the time, a senior in high school with braces and paint-stained jeans, and a laugh that echoed through the whole house when she found something funny enough. She was Jake's kid sister. "That was all. I'm serious," he said. "She's off. You, me, us, this friendship, it doesn't survive that. I've seen it happen to other guys. Best friend starts dating the sister, then they break up, and suddenly the whole thing falls apart. Promise me." So I promised. And I meant it. I meant it for years. I meant it when Nora came to visit Jake in Asheville the summer she turned 21, and I noticed, for the first time, that she wasn't a kid anymore. She had this quiet intensity about her, a way of looking at you that made you feel like she could see straight through the version of yourself you showed the world. She painted watercolors of mountain ridges and old barns and left them drying on Jake's kitchen table. One night, the 3 of us sat on the fire escape of Jake's old apartment, and Nora told me about a dream she kept having. A house at the end of a gravel road with a blue front door and a garden full of wildflowers. She described every detail like it was a memory, not a dream. And I remember thinking I've never met anyone who lives so deeply inside their own imagination. But I kept my promise. I didn't let myself think about her that way. Not then. And when Jake moved to Seattle 3 years ago for a job in tech, and Nora moved to Charlotte to teach art at a middle school, I told myself the distance made it easier. I rarely saw her. We exchanged maybe a dozen texts a year, birthday messages, a photo of a sunset, a link to a song one of us thought the other would like. It was nothing. It was safe. But that night in November, when she stood in my doorway trembling and said she had nowhere else to go, everything I had buried for almost a decade came flooding up so fast I could barely breathe. I pulled her inside without a word. I took the suitcase from her hand and set it against the wall. I guided her to the couch and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders while she sat there staring at the floor, trying to stop crying and failing. I didn't ask questions. I just went to the kitchen, heated water for tea, and brought it to her in the blue mug with the chipped handle. The only mug I owned that felt like it belonged to someone who cared about small things. She wrapped both hands around it and whispered, "Thank you." I sat on the coffee table across from her, close enough that our knees almost touched, and waited. 5 minutes passed. The rain kept hitting the window. Finally, she spoke. I was engaged. I felt the words land somewhere in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. I didn't know she was engaged. Jake hadn't mentioned it, but then Jake and I had talked less in the past year. The distance and time zones slowly stretching the thread between us thinner than either of us wanted to admit. "His name is Drew," she continued, voice flat. "We've been together 2 years. The wedding was supposed to be in March. I found out last week that he's been seeing someone else for 6 months. She paused. Her jaw tightened. When I confronted him, he said I was overreacting, that it didn't mean anything, that if I really loved him, I'd understand that people aren't perfect. She looked up at me with red eyes full of a fury that was barely holding itself together. "He told me I was the problem, Caleb, that I expected too much from people." I said nothing for a long moment. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because the anger building inside me was so sudden and sharp that I needed a second to make sure my voice would come out steady. "You're not the problem," I said, "and you don't expect too much." She stared at me. A tear slipped down her cheek and she didn't bother wiping it. "I left Charlotte 3 days ago. I stayed in a motel off I-44 2 nights, but I couldn't afford a third. My mom's in Florida with her boyfriend, and she made it pretty clear she doesn't have room. Jake's in Seattle, and I didn't want to fly across the country like some kind of emergency. And I just thought." She trailed off and looked down at her hands. I finished the sentence in my head before she said it out loud. "You were the only person I could think of who wouldn't make me feel worse for showing up like this." I swallowed hard. "You're staying here," I said. It came out more firmly than I intended, but I didn't take it back. "The couch folds out. It's not fancy, but it's warm and it's dry, and no one is going to make you feel like you're a burden in this apartment." She opened her mouth to argue. I could see it forming, the automatic refusal, the pride that every Callahan carried like armor, but something in my face must have stopped her, because she closed her mouth and nodded once. Very slowly. That first night, I lay in my bed on the other side of the wall and stared at the ceiling for 3 hours. I could hear her breathing through the thin plaster, uneven at first, then gradually slower as she fell asleep. And I thought about Jake. I thought about the promise. I thought about the fact that his sister was sleeping 12 feet away from me, and the only thing standing between my feelings and a catastrophe was a wall I had built inside myself years ago that was now developing cracks I couldn't ignore. The next morning I awoke at 6, made coffee, and found Nora already sitting at the kitchen table with her sketchbook open. She had drawn the view from my living room window, the mountains half hidden in morning mist, the rooftops below catching the first pale light. It was beautiful, not in a polished gallery-ready way, but in the way that truth is beautiful when someone puts it on paper without trying to make it anything other than what it is. She looked up when she heard me. "I hope the coffee maker noise didn't wake you." I couldn't sleep past 5. I poured 2 cups and sat across from her. "You're welcome to anything in this kitchen, which isn't much, but it's yours while you're here." She smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. It was small, barely there, but it changed the whole room. We fell into a rhythm faster than I expected. I left for work at 7. She stayed behind and cleaned the apartment. Not because I asked her to, but because she said the movement helped her stop thinking. By the time I came home each evening, the place looked different. She had reorganized the bookshelves by color. She had put a small glass jar of wildflowers on the windowsill. Purple and white ones she had found growing in the lot behind the building. She cooked dinner most nights. Simple things like pasta with roasted tomatoes or soup made from whatever was in the fridge. One evening I came home, and the whole apartment smelled like cinnamon and brown sugar. She had baked a pie using a recipe she found in an old cookbook Mrs. Hayworth had lent her from the shop downstairs. It wasn't perfect. The crust was a little too thick on one side, and the filling had bubbled over and burned a ring on the bottom of the oven. But when she set it on the counter and looked at me with flour on her cheek, and this cautious, hopeful expression like she wasn't sure whether she was allowed to be proud of something small, I felt something crack open inside my chest that I had spent years sealing shut. I told her it was the best pie I'd ever tasted. She rolled her eyes and said I was lying. I wasn't lying. It wasn't about the pie. It was about the fact that she was starting to build again, instead of just surviving. The third night she was there, I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of muffled crying through the wall. I lay still for a few minutes, unsure whether to go to her or give her the dignity of falling apart in private. Then the crying got worse. A jagged, breathless sound that told me this wasn't just sadness. It was the kind of grief that grabs you by the throat when everyone else is asleep and there's no one left to perform strength for. I got up, walked to the living room, and sat down on the floor next to the couch, without touching her. I didn't say anything. I just sat there. After a while, her hand found mine in the dark and she held it so tightly my knuckles ached. We stayed like that until her breathing slowed and her grip loosened and she fell asleep again. In the morning, neither of us mentioned it, but something had shifted between us. Some invisible wall had come down a few inches, and the air in the apartment felt different, heavier, and lighter at the same time. The way the air feels right after a storm passes and leaves everything soaked and clean. And every evening we sat together on the couch and talked. Not about Drew, not about the engagement. We talked about everything else. She told me about the students in her art class who reminded her why she became a teacher. I told her about the client in Biltmore Village who cried when she saw her finished bookshelves because they looked exactly like the ones her late grandmother had in her house. We talked about music, about the way certain songs attach themselves to specific memories, and you can never hear them the same way again. We talked about loneliness, not in a dramatic way, just honestly. The way two people can when they've both spent enough nights alone to stop pretending it doesn't bother them. And every night, when she said goodnight and disappeared behind the folding screen I had set up to give her privacy, I lay in bed and fought the same battle with myself. I kept hearing Jake's voice. She's off. I called Jake on a Saturday morning, 10 days after Nora arrived. I hadn't told him she was here. I didn't plan what I was going to say. I just needed to hear his voice and figure out whether the person I was becoming was someone he would still recognize. Caleb. He picked up on the second ring, voice big and warm the way it always was. Man, it's been too long. How's the wood business? I smiled despite everything. Good busy. Listen, Jake, I need to tell you something. He went quiet. Jake always knew when I was serious before I even said it. Nora's here, I said. She's been staying at my place for about a week and a half. She left Drew. He was cheating on her. The silence lasted 5 seconds, which doesn't sound like a lot until you're counting them with your heart in your throat. Is she okay? He asked. She's getting there. Why didn't she call me? She didn't want to be an emergency. He exhaled slowly. That sounds like Nora. Another pause. Longer this time. Then his voice changed, dropped half a register into something careful and deliberate. Caleb, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. I closed my eyes. Are you asking what I think you're asking? Yeah, I am. I stood at my kitchen window and watched the mountains through the glass, and told my best friend the truth for the first time in almost 10 years. I don't know what's happening, Jake. I haven't done anything. I haven't said anything. But I'd be lying if I told you I don't feel something. I've felt it for a long time. I just never let it be real because I made you a promise. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the hum of whatever city noise surrounded him in Seattle. I waited for anger, for betrayal, for the sound of a friendship ending. Instead, he said, I know. I blinked. You know, I've known since that summer she visited and you couldn't look at her for more than 3 seconds without turning red. I'm not blind, Caleb. I just didn't say anything because you were keeping your word and I respected that. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass. So what happens now? Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I made you promise that when we were kids, we were drinking bad beer and talking like we had the world figured out. I didn't know anything about anything. I was trying to protect my sister from getting hurt, and I thought the best way to do that was to keep her away from the people closest to me. He paused. But you're the best man I know. And if she's standing in your kitchen right now, it's because she already chose you, whether either of you knows it yet. I couldn't speak for a few seconds. Jake, don't screw it up, he said, and don't you dare hurt her, or I will fly across this country and take apart every piece of furniture you've ever built. I laughed, and the sound came out broken and relieved at the same time. I won't. I know you won't. That's why I'm saying it's okay. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time and just breathed. Something that had been locked inside my chest for years was slowly opening, and the feeling was so unfamiliar I didn't even have a name for it yet. But I wasn't ready to tell Nora, not yet. She was still healing. The last thing she needed was another man standing in front of her with expectations and weight and need. So I waited. I waited through the rest of November. I waited through the first week of December, when she started painting again, spreading her watercolors across the kitchen table and filling the apartment with color. I waited through the night she came back from a walk, looking lighter than I had seen her in weeks, and said, I think I'm starting to feel like myself again. I waited even when it hurt. Even when she fell asleep on the couch during a movie, and her head rested against my shoulder, and her hair smelled like the lavender soap, she kept on the bathroom shelf. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just let her sleep and memorized the weight of her against me, and told myself that some things are worth being patient for. If you've ever loved someone and had to stand next to them pretending you didn't, you know exactly the kind of quiet war I'm talking about. It's not dramatic. There's no yelling, no breaking things, no standing in the rain making declarations. It's just you, lying awake at 3 a.m., listening to the person on the other side of the wall, breathing softly in their sleep, knowing that one wrong word could ruin the best thing that's ever walked into your life. There was one night in early December that nearly broke me. A man came to the apartment. I was still at work when it happened, but Mrs. Hayworth called me, her voice tight and urgent, and said some man was at the front door arguing with Nora, and she didn't like the sound of it. I drove home in 12 minutes, a drive that usually takes 20. When I got there, Drew was standing on the sidewalk outside my building. He was taller than I expected, clean-shaven, wearing a wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Nora was on the steps with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and even from across the street I could see she had been crying. I got out of the truck and walked toward them without running, because running would have made it a scene, and Nora didn't need a scene. She needed someone steady. Drew turned when he heard my boots on the pavement. He looked me up and down, sawdust still on my jeans, sweat stains under my arms, a pencil behind my ear that I had forgotten to take out. "Who's this?" he asked Nora, voice dripping with something halfway between amusement and contempt. "The handyman." Nora's voice was ice. "He's my friend, and he's more of a man than you'll ever be. Go home, Drew." Drew ignored her and stepped toward me. "Listen, buddy, I don't know what she's told you, but this is between me and my fiancé." "Ex-fiancé," Nora said. I stopped about 3 feet from him and said, very calmly, "She asked you to leave." He looked at me like I was an inconvenience, a speed bump on the road to getting what he wanted. Then he leaned in close enough that I could smell his cologne, and said, quiet enough that Nora couldn't hear, "She'll come back. They always do." I didn't hit him. I wanted to. Every muscle in my body wanted to. But I had spent 10 years building things with my hands, and I knew the difference between the urge to destroy and the choice to build. So instead I said, loud enough for Nora and Mrs. Hayworth and anyone else listening, "If you come back here, I'll call the police. If you contact her, I'll file a restraining order. She doesn't belong to you. She never did. Now leave." He stared at me for a long, ugly second. Then he laughed, shook his head, and walked to his car. When he drove away, Nora sank onto the steps and pressed her palms against her eyes. I sat down beside her. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she reached over and took my hand, the same way she had in the dark that night when she was crying through the wall, and held it like it was the only solid thing left in a world that kept trying to knock her sideways. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't have to thank me. I know. That's why it means so much." The moment I almost ruined everything was December 14th. Nora had been with me for nearly a month. She was in the kitchen making breakfast, humming a song I didn't recognize, and the morning light was hitting her face in a way that made her look like one of her own paintings. Warm and luminous and unbearably real. She turned and caught me staring. "What?" she asked, half smiling. "Nothing," I said too quickly. She tilted her head. "You've been looking at me like that a lot lately, like you're trying to figure something out." I opened my mouth and then closed it. She set down the spatula. The smile faded. Something shifted behind her eyes. A recognition. A question she had maybe been asking herself quietly, and was only now brave enough to let reach the surface. "Caleb," she said softly, "what's happening here?" I could have deflected. I could have made a joke. I could have walked out of the room and bought myself another week of silence. But she had asked me directly, and I had never been able to lie to a Callahan. "Something I've been trying to ignore for a very long time," I said. She didn't move. She didn't speak. The only sound was the eggs crackling in the pan behind her. Then she whispered, "How long?" "Since the summer you were 21 and you told me about the house with the blue door." Her eyes filled. She pressed her lips together and looked away, blinking fast. "Jake," she said. "I talked to Jake." Her gaze snapped back to me. "You told him?" "I told him the truth, that I feel something I've never felt for anyone else, and that I've been keeping it locked away because I promised him I would." She stared at me, barely breathing. "What did he say?" "He said I'm the best man he knows, and that I better not screw it up." A sound came out of her that was half laugh, half sob. She covered her face with both hands and stood there in the middle of my kitchen, shoulders shaking, and I crossed the room and pulled her against me and held her while the eggs burned and the smoke alarm went off, and neither of us moved to stop it. When she finally looked up, her face was streaked with tears, and she was smiling. "I have been so scared," she whispered. "Of what?" "That you didn't feel it. That I was imagining it. That I was broken from Drew and just projecting onto the first person who was kind to me." I shook my head slowly. "You're not broken, and this isn't projection. I've been in love with you since before you even knew I existed as anything other than your brother's friend, who was too shy to make eye contact." She laughed through her tears. "You were never that shy. You just looked away every time I caught you, because I was terrified of me, of what it would mean if I stopped looking away." She reached up and put her hand on my face, her palm warm against my jaw, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The smoke alarm was still shrieking. The eggs were charcoal. The apartment smelled like a small kitchen fire, and I had never been happier in my entire life. We didn't rush. That was the one thing we both agreed on without having to say it. She had just come out of something painful, and I had spent a decade keeping this feeling in a locked room inside my chest. Neither of us wanted to move so fast that we broke the thing we were building. So we moved slowly. She stayed in the apartment, but we kept our spaces. We cooked together, walked through downtown together, sat on the fire escape in the cold December air with blankets around our shoulders, and talked until our voices went hoarse. The first time I kissed her was Christmas Eve. We were standing on the sidewalk outside Mrs. Hayworth's bookshop. Snow falling in thick, lazy flakes that caught in Nora's hair like tiny stars. The shop windows were glowing gold behind us. She was wearing my jacket because she had forgotten hers, and it hung past her wrists like a child playing dress-up. She looked up at me and said, "I think my dream changed." The house with the blue door. It still has the blue door, but now you're standing in it. I kissed her right there on the sidewalk with snowflakes melting on our faces and the faint sound of Christmas music leaking through someone's window. And when I pulled back, she was crying again, but this time every tear was warm. Mrs. Hayworth, who I hadn't realized was watching from behind the counter inside, tapped on the glass and gave me a thumbs up. Nora buried her face in my chest and laughed so hard her whole body shook. January came, and Nora started looking for work. She applied to 3 schools in the Asheville area and got an interview at a small private academy in Black Mountain that specialized in arts education. The night before the interview, she sat on the couch, surrounded by lesson plans and portfolio samples, and I could see the old anxiety creeping back in, the fear of not being enough. The echoes of Drew's voice telling her she expected too much from people. I knelt in front of her and took the papers out of her hands. "Hey," I said, "look at me." She did. "You are the most talented, most thoughtful, most quietly extraordinary person I have ever known. That school would be lucky to have you, and if they can't see that, we'll find one that can." She stared at me for a long time. "No one has ever talked to me the way you do." "What way?" Like I'm worth the effort of choosing the right words. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just kissed her forehead and handed the papers back. She got the job. When she came home with the offer letter, she ran up the stairs so fast, she tripped on the last step, and I caught her in the doorway. Both of us laughing, and she held up the letter and said, "I start in 2 weeks." I lifted her off the ground and spun her around in the hallway while Mrs. Hayworth shouted congratulations from the bottom of the stairs. February brought a phone call I wasn't expecting. Jake called on a Tuesday evening while Nora and I were cooking together, her stirring the sauce while I chopped onions and tried not to cry from both the onions and the overwhelming normalcy of a life I had never dared to imagine. I stepped into the bedroom to take the call. "How's my sister?" he asked. "Happy," I said. "I think she's really happy." Jake, you was quiet for a second. "Good, because I'm coming to visit next month and I need to see it with my own eyes before I fully approve of this situation." I grinned. "You already approved." "I approved in theory. I need to approve in person. There's a difference." When Jake arrived in March, he stood in my doorway and looked at the apartment. The wildflowers on the windowsill, the watercolors drying on the kitchen table, the 2 coffee mugs sitting side by side on the counter. Then he looked at me, and then at Nora, who was standing behind me with her hands clasped together, like she was waiting for a verdict. Jake walked over to his sister and hugged her for a long time without saying anything. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet, which was something I had seen exactly twice in 15 years of friendship. "You look like yourself again," he said. "I feel like myself again," she whispered. He looked over her shoulder at me. "You did that." Nora shook her head before I could answer. "He didn't fix me, Jake. He just made it safe enough for me to fix myself." Jake nodded slowly. Then he walked over to me, put his hand on my shoulder, and squeezed once. Hard. "I was wrong to make you promise that," he said quietly so only I could hear. "No," I said. "You were trying to protect her. I'd have done the same thing." He smiled. "Yeah, but I would have broken the promise a lot sooner." That night, the 3 of us sat on the fire escape with a bottle of cheap wine and talked until 2 a.m., just like we were back in college, except everything was different and everything was better. Jake told us about a woman he'd met in Seattle, a marine biologist who laughed at all his worst jokes. Nora told him about her students, the ones who were starting to trust her enough to show her their real work instead of the safe, pretty versions they thought adults wanted to see. I told them about a custom dining table I was building for a young couple who had just bought their first home. How the husband had asked me to carve their initials into the underside of the table so it would always be there, even if no one else ever saw it. Nora looked at me when I said that, and I saw something in her eyes that I will never forget. A look that said, "I see you, not just now, but all the years you waited, all the nights you kept your word, all the mornings you woke up alone and chose to be patient instead of reckless." And I knew then that the promise I'd made to Jake all those years ago hadn't kept me from love. It had kept me honest long enough for love to arrive at exactly the right time. 6 months later, on a warm evening in September, I drove Nora down a gravel road outside Black Mountain that I had found while scouting wood from a local mill. At the end of the road sat a small house with a wraparound porch and a garden that had gone wild with asters and goldenrod, and black-eyed Susans. The house needed work. The porch railing was rotting, the roof had a patch of missing shingles, and the front door was painted a green so faded it was almost gray. But it was the right house. I knew it in my bones. Nora got out of the truck and stood in the tall grass, staring at it. She didn't speak for a long time. "Caleb," she said finally, and her voice was shaking. "I know," I said. "It needs a new door," she whispered. I reached into the truck bed and pulled back a moving blanket. Underneath was a door I had been building in secret for 3 weeks in my workshop after hours. Solid oak hand-planed with a small glass panel at the top, and painted the exact shade of blue she had described to me on a fire escape 9 years ago. She turned around and saw it, and her hands went to her mouth, and she didn't make a sound but her whole body trembled, the way it had on the first night she showed up at my apartment. Except this time, it wasn't grief. It was the opposite of grief. It was the feeling of arriving somewhere you've been dreaming about your whole life and discovering that it's real, that it was always real. that someone loved you enough to build it with his own hands and wait until you were ready to walk through it. I carried the door across the yard and leaned it against the porch railing. Then I turned to her and said, "It's ours. I put an offer in last month. The owner accepted yesterday." She walked toward me slowly, tears streaming, and stopped a foot away. "You built me a blue door? I built you a blue door." She kissed me in the wild garden with the mountains going purple behind us and the last light of the day turning everything to gold. And I held her and thought about all the years I had waited, all the nights I had stared at ceilings and kept promises and swallowed words I was afraid to say. And I knew, standing there with her, that none of it had been wasted. Every single day of patience had been leading me here, to this woman, to this house, to this door that I had built with my own hands, because she once described it to me in a dream and I had never forgotten. That night, we sat on the porch steps of our house and looked out at the dark mountains. The stars were bright and close, the way they only get in the country, away from city light. Nora leaned her head against my shoulder. "Do you remember what I said the night I showed up at your door? You said you had nowhere else to go." She shook her head gently. "That wasn't true. I had other places I could have gone. I chose you. I think I always knew I would." I put my arm around her and pulled her close and listened to the crickets and the wind moving through the tall grass. And somewhere out in Seattle, I imagined Jake sitting on his own porch with his phone in his hand, reading the photo I had just sent him, the two of us standing in front of a house at the end of a gravel road with a blue door that hadn't been hung yet but already looked like it had been there forever. His reply came through a minute later. 3 words: "About damn time."